deterministic thinking has kind of had its day, right? We live in a probabilistic world, and we need to have excessive cognitive humility.
Hey, I love technology. I'm like incredibly pro, but I'm worried about a loss of intellectual autonomy. If you transfer your moral decision-making to a collective, you become like a bee in a beehive, and it doesn't really matter as much what you're doing individually.
I look at dogmatism as brain death.
There was a lot of like philosophy to law pipelines. What we're really interested in now is philosophy to code. Rather than simply producing papers and having arguments, we want to translate those into math, into algorithms, and we want to translate those into open source software.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. I have been looking forward to today's guest for quite some time. My guest is Brendan McCord, the founder of the Cosmos Institute, a philanthropic effort to explore the intersection of AI and philosophy. But he's also a little bit of a superhero, in my opinion. Brendan, your life, like I as I was getting ready, I'm like, I want to make a movie about Brendan's life. You've had an amazing career. You were a naval officer who spent 610 days below water. I mean, oh my God. Your degrees from Harvard and MIT. You're now a visiting fellow at St. Catherine's College at Oxford. I mean, wow. I'm very intimidated, but welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's jump right into why the Cosmos Institute. I love the play with Cosmos for Taxis, right? Cosmos is the Greek for from below, and Taxis is planning from above. But why did you land on what is also one of my favorite topics, the intersection of AI and philosophy?
Yeah, so it kind of started for me 2.5 years ago. I remember having this moment of reflection where I had just sold 2 AI companies, and I had just had the second of my 2 kids, the older of whom did these back here.
Love them.
Yeah. And for people who have had either of those events or others like them happen, although maybe there's nothing like having kids, you know that this kind of thrusts upon you this moment of reflection. For me, the question was, how do I spend the rest of my time? How do I do something that benefits humanity and is worthy of the rest of my professional years? And also, what do I model for these little kids? That put me into reading, because I realized that I had this very large gap between a kind of zeal for, public improvement, like wanting to help my fellow man, and the actual groundedness, like intellectually, that I had about what the principles of human progress really were. So I started reading. 15 minutes a day was kind of all I could muster. I had basically given it up during my startup phase, but that grew and grew and grew to 3-4 hours a day. Had a great intellectual mentor here in Austin, who helped me with a wonderful syllabus. And this allowed me to discover philosophy. After doing that, it kind of gradually took over my life until I felt like I had to do almost nothing but read philosophy. And I turned kind of back towards the work that I had done previously in the AI community, but with a new lens. I sort of said, how's the AI community thinking about this technology, which is arguably the most important, I mean, maybe not more important than the language, but arguably, let's say, the end of the modern tech project. How's the community thinking about it in terms of philosophy? And I really didn't like what I saw. So this led to the creation of Cosmos Institute. I'd love to talk lots more about it, but it was essentially out of this concern for where the intellectual incumbent movements were and what the quality of the kind of intellectual debate was in the AI field.
Yeah, and I completely agree. Philosophy, they make a lot of jokes about philosophy majors and everything else, but when I'm asked, when I was still in asset management, people would ask me, what should I study? And that was high on my list, because it taught you not only how to think, but also how to think critically, how to take apart an argument, how to understand, and your reading list is amazing. You start with Plato and Aristotle, you go all the way through. This really surprised me, Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty, which I have read. And, to me, philosophy is basically, if you look at it in the terms of your reading list, when you start out with the Greeks and you get up to our modern philosophies, it's really a question of around power, justice, liberty, the nature of human society. And it gives us a lot of great clues on, hey, this was a very popular philosophy that didn't really work out very well, to, wow, this philosophy is working out really, really well. And then kind of a synthesis view, I think becomes more nuanced than the all or nothing. We were talking before we began recording, and I said, it drives me crazy with the world out there being so deterministic in its thought. Yeah. I often joke that deterministic thinking, 0, 100, yes, no, black, white, often leads to hilarity or tragedy because we live in a probabilistic world. But let's talk a bit about the reading list. You've got many of my favorite things on there. And then why did you craft it the way you did, which I find really intriguing and really interesting in terms of synthesizing an overall view?
Yeah. So on philosophy, I think philosophy is a kind of quixotic pursuit, especially in a very utilitarian technological world. The way I see philosophy is that it doesn't give you godlike wisdom. It doesn't give you the answers. And so it's a quest for those answers. It's a quest for the truth, but it will probably never yield them. And so why do it? Well, I mean, you gave a couple of really good reasons. The other is that it gives you an awareness of what are the perennial questions. Like what are the questions that Plato and Aristotle dealt with 2,500 years ago? How did they treat those questions? What answers did they stumble upon, and what kind of errors did they identify? This, thread of kind of constant question asking for things that don't really admit of hypothesis testing fundamentally, like questions that we're still going to be debating 10 years from now, 100 years from now, probably 1,000. That's the realm of philosophy. I also think it's the only way to kind of get liberation from the half considered truths, from the kind of more dogmatic thinking. Like Twitter makes for, really brings out some of the most dogmatic and factionalized ideas or factional, tendencies. And I think philosophy is a way to kind of get across that. But on the reading list, where that came from was I asked a few people that I really admired, what rabbit holes should I go down and which ones should I avoid? And you must allow for some open-ended exploration. Like you read a book, you see a footnote, you see a quote, you go there and you pursue right there. That has to be part of the journey. But I think there's a lot to be gained from downloading as well the kind of experience of others. So part of it was crafted in that way. I mostly did a chronological path, starting with the ancients, who thought very profoundly about these questions. They had very genuine, profound reflections, in part because they didn't inherit a lot of the complexity we have today or the assumptions we hold. And then I moved forward to the proto-Enlightenment, the birth of the modern technological project. I moved to kind of the Enlightenment proper. And then I went to the American founding. I went to some of the modern economic ideas in new institutional economics, public choice, Austrian economics, other facets, to kind of then, segue into contemporary debates. And it isn't because I think philosophy is a progressive science. In other words, it's not that I think that you start chronologically because then you get like the baby steps followed by the sophistication. I actually think there's a lot that we've forgotten about the past, and that by going back to these kind of radically alien minds, we can get better insights on where we stand today.
Agree completely. And I've always kind of looked at the philosophical Don Quixote quest as basically a fundamental dissatisfaction with the status quo, whatever the status quo happens to be, right? So, we had medieval institutions, and we had guild systems, and then we had the Enlightenment, right? And it was like, whoa. And then this continues and continues, but it also doesn't always lead to improvements. Like, for example, we compare and contrast collectivism, which you have a big reading list on Marxism and other schools of thought, versus individualism. I have a point of view there, obviously, that I don't try to hide. I think that there were some really interesting ideas for when Marx was writing at the time, but that we have progressed beyond them. I also have a lurking suspicion that in most of the collectivist texts or philosophical treatises that I've read, there's a lurking zero-sum mentality. There's this idea that everything is scarcity. We must divide that pie equally. We must make sure that everyone gets their fair share, versus the positive sum ideas that I think more individualistic free markets embrace, without missing all of the problems that free markets can have. So again, I always add that caveat. But what do you think? If you've read Hawkins' Power versus Force, I often kind of bring that book in as well, because he's really talking about the way most societies were organized basically by force throughout human history. And it was like, do this at the end of a spear, then gun, then, morass of regulations. And he chose, I think, kind of unfortunately, the word power. Many people, because we're label thinkers in many regards, many people have negative connotations with that word. But what he means by power is no. Influence. You don't command someone else to do something. You influence them through argument, through example, etc. What do you think?
Yeah, so I love reading about collectivist psychology. And sometimes, Jim, when I say that, people will say, I do too. Like and I'll realize they're saying it positively. And I love reading about the horrors of the 20th century experiments. I never want to repeat them. And they seem to occupy this sweet spot between they're so close in historical proximity, yet they're so forgotten. And there's an idea that I like. So a couple of the books that I would recommend to your listeners. I love Wild Swan and Mao the Unknown Story, both written by Yang Chang. She was the first Western PhD earner from Mao's hermetically sealed China. And she wrote these. They're very long, but they're wonderful. Wild Swans is about her mother, and her grandmother. So you get a really good cross-section of time in China, or longitudinal piece. And then Mao the Unknown Story is kind of like, I think, the best book on Mao. And then Soviet era things, Gulag Archipelago, Darkness at Noon. These are great books. But an idea that I particularly like that ties to the reading list is the man of system. And this comes from Adam Smith. It comes from the theory of moral sentiments. And it's this idea that the man of system thinks that he can control society like a machine. It's a deterministic, as you said, Jim, controllable machine. And this man of system often starts with good intentions, but in practice, he resorts to tyrannical methods. Basically, the idea is that one can be so self-satisfied that they think they control humans like they're pieces on a chessboard or organ stops, But the problem is that pieces have volition. Humans are not Newtonian. Humans move in directions that are outside of the control of those planning the system. And so the man of system is confronted with a dilemma. What do? You start by saying, well, things like privacy are cool, great. But if the system doesn't work, with privacy in place, well, then the rules have to be bent. This superstructure, once you've set it up, if the pretense is that you're going to create a system that works in a beautiful way, what happens when people don't cooperate and the system doesn't work is you kill them, or you imprison them, or you re-educate them. To some varying degree, you have to manipulate the soul to have the system work. And so I guess the message here is that whatever the system claims initially, in Soviet system, it's we're going to socialize the means of production. Whatever it claims initially, the superstructure can't control just a piece. It needs insight into everything. It has to control what is read, what is thought, and that's where it becomes this totalizing system. President Xi, says that the Soviet experiment didn't work in part because there wasn't great enough access to the mind. In other words, like the indoctrination was a failure, and that's why it didn't work. So this is not the only kind of insight on collectivism. There are other really juicy, I think, epistemological insights on why the central planning model doesn't work. There are good moral arguments, but I think one of the practical, because you brought up like kind of the lessons of experience, is that the systems become totalizing. The other thing I don't want to get off, Jim, is you talked about like probabilistic and deterministic. I think the reading list gives really good insight to this, and this is something I did not appreciate. I will say I've spent time in government, and I've been guilty of some of the man of system behaviors in writing grand plans. DoD AI strategy, I was primary author of. The Chips and Science Act, I wrote a very early and important prototype of. And both of these were very top down. I think what the reading list shows is that a human reason, this incredible superpower that we possess, the thing that kind of distinguishes us from the other animals, among other things, that we need to be very careful about the claims of reason, like what reason can do. David Hume was excellent. I always think about this phrase that his project was in a sense to use reason to whittle down the claims of reason. So in other words, as compared to some of the more, you could say ambitious, I'll put it in quotes, reformers, mostly French, the philosophes, the encyclopedists, the Rousseaus of the world, Descartes, although he was a little complicated, Hume and Ferguson and Smith and the Scottish side had a bit more of this epistemic humility, where they thought that really what reason tells us is that we can't make these predictions with a high degree of accuracy. We can't simply start from these abstract first principles and think that we can use deduction to arrive at a perfect society and then design it tabula rasa. Like that gives you the French Revolution, which was a failure. Yeah.
So another one of my favorite thinkers on this is Lewis Carroll, who famously wrote Alice in Wonderland. I wrote a lot of college term papers about how that was really Charles Dodgson, the logician, trying to demonstrate to his Victorian neighbors and fellow citizens that there were deep limits to logic. And he wrote a very short piece called What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, in which he argues that in every logical system, if you look at them as axiomatic, in other words, in no need of proof, right? When you keep going down, and all the way down to the base, what you're going to find at the base is a assumption that has no proof, that simply was a human asserting this is true. And then that brings you to Agrippa's trilemma, where the limits of logic are kind of decimated, honestly. And so I think that, again, back deterministic versus probabilistic, I think that as we get closer as a society to understanding that deterministic thinking has kind of had its day, right? We live in a probabilistic world, and pragmatically, as you mentioned, we need to have excessive cognitive humility, in my opinion, because we are always learning. One of the things that I wrote down and put on my screen for a while was most of my opinions are probably wrong. And the reason I did that was to remind myself, these are not facts. These are, for the most part, conjectures, thesis, all of those things. Let's continually test them, and let's upgrade and update our thinking as we learn more and more and more. So, for example, just looking pragmatically, as you say, versus collectivism versus individualism and free markets, objectively, it's very difficult to make the argument that free markets just didn't work better, right? With all of their problems, they really delivered on many of their promises where most of the old philosophies didn't. And I kind of think, I look at dogmatism as brain death, because essentially what you're doing is just repeating something that you have absolutely no uncertainty about. And to me, that is catastrophic, because we live in a world that is uncertain.
Yeah. This relates quite heavily to, or quite directly to, the discourse around existential risk in AI. And I think there's a lot we could talk about there. I'd love to, get into that. But I will say that, David Deutsch, one of your, I know, intellectual heroes, and he talks persuasively about this, that, really we have these subjective expectations about the future, and they come in various strengths. And you could say, Jim, are you sure that this is going to happen? Are you very sure? I'm very, very sure, that sort of thing. But there isn't a very good intersubjective comparison that we might do. If I'm very sure and you're very, very sure, how do we figure that out? We can quantify it, and we can try to kind of like harmonize. Neither of us should say that it's impossible or certain, because the laws of epistemology tell us that, if we discover something later that it would alter that probability, like the 0 and the 1 are kind of untenable positions. But the problem with existential risk, among many things, is that if the likelihood of some bad thing happening does fall within that 0 to 1 range, not inclusive, then it's and it has an infinite disutility, like a very small probability times a negative infinity utility, that's still a negative infinity number. And so it creates a situation where anything one might do in light of this takes on kind of cosmic significance. It's the most important thing possible. I think you have to kind of reject that premise, and you have to say, actually, we must maintain this idea of an unknowable future subject to an unlimited number of forces. We have to be scenario agnostic. That doesn't mean we don't work constructively on risks. It doesn't mean we don't point them out and work very seriously on perceived risks, whether they're the kind of banal, ordinary risks that I care a lot about, or the species-ending ones, which I also do care about, but I think are I think there's an under-provisioning of the former thought. So there's lots more on the kind of risk side. But I think you mentioned the free market, which is a topic near and dear to me. One point I wanted to make here is that before I put together the Cosmos Institute, the very first instinct that I had after being kind of taken over by a love of philosophy was, wow, there must be more people like me. I actually didn't write term papers on Lewis Carroll and things like that. It sounds like you have an interesting academic background. I was STEM and business, basically. And I never really had exposure to these great thinkers. And so I realized there are many technologists who are like me, and they're building the future. They're like the John Stuart Mills of today, but they're translating ideas into code that allocate billions of human minds 24/7. I mean, it's incredible, high leverage, formative position in society. Where are they engaging with these big questions? And so the first thing I did was I got introduced to Tyler Cowen, and I knew right away that it was a brilliant fit. And we put together this thing called the Mill Fellowship, John Stuart Mill Fellowship, to try to cultivate a new breed of philosopher entrepreneurs. People like Patrick Collison, who's, leading Stripe, or Reid Hoffman, like people who engage deeply with philosophy, right? In a way that, I think, Jim, you embody this really, really well. Because the thought is that they're going to be much better at deliberating regarding the alternative ends of their creations. So, we put that together, and what we walk through together is what are the key ideas behind markets? What is the nature and the limitations of political action? And what are the possibilities of bottoms up solutions in society? It's kind of three flavors. We hit, Locke, Montesquieu, Mill, those kinds of thinkers, as well as Hayek on the markets. And it's just really beautiful. But I'd love to talk more about the market, because I think it gets very little love. I went to Harvard Business School, and I like to say now that, it's kind of a bastion of capitalism, but at no point do we actually talk about the promise of markets or the role of markets. The only focus is on reimagining markets through things that I later, kind of come to understand as like syndicalist, socialist ideas, like very, very interventionist kind of ideas to try to fix perceived ills.
Yeah, and the takeaway I have there is that, human OS, human operating system, is, I think, primarily an emotional one, not necessarily an intellectual one. And I think that the ruling human emotion is fear. And that makes sense if you look at evolution, right? For most of our history as a species, fear was a very important thing to have, especially fear of novel threats, right? I joke a lot about how the fact that we're all descendants from the cowards who ran away. If we're out on a savannah in Africa and there's a bush rustling, we're the descendants of the guys who saw that and ran as fast as they could in the other direction, and not the curious one who said, "Ooh, I wonder what this is," and then he gets eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. And I think that I do believe that we are able to demonstrate cumulative cultural evolution. So I don't believe that we are tied simply to our biological evolution. But I do believe that we have to take them into consideration when talking about these ideas, because they pull us in a direction that is almost unavoidable if the emotions get involved. But you mentioned that you want to talk a little bit about the various schools of thought around AI, which I think let's do that right now. It came later in my notes, but since you brought it up, look, there's AI pessimism, which is, it's going to kill us all. Let's nuke the GPU plants and, be done with it. Then we have long-termism. We have effective altruism, and we have the accelerationist bros. And listen, if I have to put myself on that continuum, I'm closer to the accelerationist bros than I am to the AI doomers, but with a big asterisk, which is, whoa, let's be moderately optimistic, but always aware of the fact that we are going to create a whole new set of problems. But hopefully they're going to be better problems. But all progress comes with problems. And again, with a nod to Deutsch, we have to understand that we're going to get a lot wrong too. So take us through your views, like on each of those, AI pessimism all the way through accelerationism. And I know where you land, but I want you to tell our audience where you land.
Yeah. So when I first put together Cosmos Institute, which by the way, tries to kind of conceive of technology as a triumph of human agency. So a lot of these topics we're talking about come back to that for me. Technology is a means of human flourishing, and I'll touch on why that's important as it flows through this. And then later we can talk about some of the things we're actually doing to kind of realize that. But when I first, put it together, the first thing I did was try to look at the landscape like any entrepreneur would do. You're starting a new business. In this case, it's a nonprofit. Figure out where things stand and how you what the white space is. And I kind of got together a group of brilliant people, AI folks, as well as like forensic accountants, and try to like trace out the money flows. Just because I felt like there was, when you're trying to understand like a graph of ideas, you need to understand the money piece as well. And so we came up with some pretty interesting conclusions. But I'm going to walk through it at a high level. I think you got the categories right, Jim. The pessimism side, in its worst form, becomes kind of an apocalyptic, almost eschatological, like end times view of risk. It's very quantified. That's what animates it. It's very popular in the practitioner circles, people who are very mathy. And it's kind of like I finally got around to watching Oppenheimer, and it's kind of like this, denouncing of a creation, in a kind of hubristic awe of power. You mentioned fear. Fear is actually really important in this camp, and it's kind of ironic because to have an atavistic fear, that we sort of had in our common ancestry, Jim, when we were running away from the scary, predators, it isn't really compatible with the idea that we're kind of rationalist, almost disembodied minds. In other words, the cold rationalism ironically creates the most fertile soil for this fear emotion that is part of our pre-rational selves. So it's really, I think of the pessimist position as three entangled philosophies. I think there's rationalism, there's long-termism, there's effective altruism. Very briefly on each of these. Each of them is kind of like what they say on the tin, if you will. So like rationalism is about being rational. It's ostensibly that. But what's interesting is that it's not a kind of rationality that Plato or Kant would recognize, or even modern thinkers like Nicholas Nassim Taleb. It's a kind of Bayesian updating on a value function. So there's a lot more that rationalism, and reason entails. This is a very narrow slice on that. I don't want people to be confused that that's the only way to be rational. But it basically posits that preserving life is paramount and preconditional to, everything else, fulfilling any other needs and desires. So it tends towards a so-called extropianism, which is, kind of a defeat of death. This actually comes out of Bacon and Descartes. It's a very long-term idea, but it's given new life in the form of Yudkowsky's Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. I'm sure most people know, but this is like the greatest fan fiction of Harry Potter. It ends with Harry Potter defeating death. This is the rationalist stream. The second camp is long-termism, which is very future-oriented. Again, as it seems, it's a self-sacrificial philosophy. It's something that's very focused on the existential threats. Existential threats can be natural, they can be artificial. This tends to focus more on the artificial ones. But it's kind of like reaching into an urn of innovation and then picking out not a white ball, not a gray ball, but a black ball that's going to destroy us. It focuses a lot on the extreme case. It's kind of like if I'm teaching my kids to ride a bike and they're like just laser focused on the pothole on the side of the road. Like what's going to happen? They're probably going to drive into the pothole, or at least they're going to have trouble. But it's a very excess focus on the extreme case. So the banal threats, the natural threats that lie before us, the things that might happen in the next, few years or 100 years are not really a concern for this school. It also blinds us to kind of what I call the Tocquevillian threats, which we can talk about later. But I think Tocqueville is like an underexplored voice in this, and I just think he's brilliant. That's long-termism. The third is effective altruism, which is the most effective, I'll say adopted academic theory since Marxism. It's a very popular theory. It is a consequentialist philosophy that has us judge any behaviors that we do that are other regarding by their fruits or, by their results, not by their intentions. So it's a kind of one of these things where I love phrases like this because who can disagree with effective altruism? It's like effective altruism. These are great words. But there are a few radical premises here. One is that basically proximity and time shouldn't govern this kind of behavior. So a util is a util, whether it's yours or a child in, Africa, or a future human who's 17 generations away from being born, or even a shrimp. These are all all of this can be reduced to utils. And saving humanity in the infinite future is the most important task if you're committed to altruism. I mentioned this problematic equation. If you kind of take all these things together, all these premises, you have, small probability of doom times negative infinity utils equals negative infinity utils. And some people challenge this. Some people say, Brendan, you're being too simplistic. There's going to be like a heat death of the universe that will cause it to not be a negative infinity util event or whatever. I was just like 2 weekends ago with like some of the top people in this field, and they're very committed to this equation. Like I think this is straight up the equation that drives it. The other difficulty with EA, effective altruism, is it's fundamentally not individualistic. You must take the perspective of the universe. Jim, you probably have some projects and plans that you think are going to, make the world a better place, but you have to kind of surrender those to what the calculation says. Whereas Aristotle and a lot of other moral, philosophers would say that any moral decision inherently springs from the individual. So it kind of alienates us from our moral choice. I am not surprised, and this is kind of a low blow, but I'm not surprised to see moral failings in this group in areas like sexual assault or integrity in business, precisely because if you transfer your moral decision-making to a collective, to a mass calculation, you become like a bee in a beehive, and it doesn't really matter as much what you're doing individually. So again, probably we'll get a lot of flack for saying that, but that's that. That's the risk school. And what I try to do there is to always take the arguments pretty seriously. I try not to say, oh, these are people who have like, bad vibes or something like that. I think the moment you start to say that a position is just like immoral because of, I don't know, these kind of like ad hominem on an ad hominem basis, I think you've lost the plot. On accelerationism and kind of the other side, I'll just briefly touch on that, Jim, which is to say that I think it gets a lot right. I think I'm with you that if I have to pick, which I don't, and then I would sort of like lean in that direction for sure. The optimism part is right. I love the Deutsch, idea that the future is not predetermined. We must make it so. It can be better than the past, and it's our responsibility to do it. I'm all for that. I also think markets are this brilliant discovery machine, this driver of adaptation, this wonderful way of using knowledge in society. I think this is one of the biggest takeaways from my reading list, is just understanding what markets do to be able to harness this dispersed local knowledge that we have and to kind of allow us to have, an adaptation, a mutual co-adaptation of our plans in this like dynamical process that, it's just, that's one of the most important ideas ever conceived. So I think that is actually right. And I think of accelerationism as kind of like classical liberalism without the moral architecture. When I say that, what I mean by this is really three things. One is that accelerationism treats human life like a variable in a thermodynamic equation, or like a link in an evolutionary chain. It is fundamentally non-humanistic. To say more about that, EACs, effective accelerationists, who I think are principled and not just vibes, they get accused of that. I don't think that's right. I think we have to take the ideas seriously. They think of biology as a universal mechanical thermodynamic computer. They think about a thermodynamic will. I don't think they say that, but that's what they think about. It's a thermodynamic God that animates all matter. And it's this singular force that drives growth. It drives expansion. Capitalism is the meta-consciousness. And our only imperative as a species is abstract entropy production or greater consumption of energy. So it's a thermodynamic will that kind of receives metaphysical characteristics, spiritual impulse, and it does so at the expense of humans. Nothing human makes it out of the near future. So that's one. That's a big problem, that we view human life in that way. Two is that we mistake the end of human life with the means. And what I mean by this is tech progress and and economic progress is not the sole end. That's not the objective, the purpose, to turn the crank on technology. Should we do that? Hell yes, we should do that. It's amazing it's like empirically amazing. And it's just this wonderful triumph, as I said, of human agency. But the goal of human life is a kind of flourishing of the individual that technology is causally efficacious for, but not the same as. So this is the second, is a fundamental confusion. And what this leads to in say Andreessen's piece is humans become this kind of like passive agent of this amoral technology trajectory. We just sort of stand by, we do things, we contribute to it, but like it doesn't have any moral property other than, we should make it go. Whereas if you think tech is just a tool, it opens up this like really complex space of moral deliberation, political philosophy, things that are not very fun for most people, but are kind of essential. Third thing is the EAC and techno-optimist community, I think, are very polemical. They're very culture war focused. And they kind of have a hatred of argument. In other words, if I go and I say, hey, I love technology, I'm like incredibly pro, but I'm worried about a loss of intellectual autonomy among people. And I worry a lot about this. Okay, if I'm worried about that, I'm blacklisted. I'm a doomer for saying that. Basically, I'm against technology, and literally, I have friends who have been like blacklisted on this because they say that we should be responsible or whatever. And so when you do that and you hate reason, it descends into a form of misology, like a hatred of argument, where again you've lost the plot.
The one thing, as I was watching the EAC group version, one of my worries was, this is beginning to look a lot more like a religion to me. And I'm not anti-religion, right? I'm agnostic, because I think atheism requires as much faith as the truest believer in a God, for the most part. So I'm just willing to say, hey, I don't know. I think it would be super cool if there were other forms of lives and gods and whatnot, but I have no evidence of that. And so my challenge with religion, at least historically, is that I just looked at it as yet another, and a very clever, by the way, command and control system to manage your society, right? Like the ancient Babylonians wanted to rule Sumeria, but they realized they had a really puny god, right? And so they're like, we got to fix this. So they came up with a new story. Their god actually defeated this monster that was going to kill humanity, ripped it in half. The half that it threw in the air became the sky. The half that it threw down, what became the ground. And presto changeo, you've got like the coolest religion, and therefore you have the right to rule. And I just think that the reductio ad absurdum is at play here. And I, like you, definitely lean toward the effective accelerationism, but I really think that the weak chain in the links here is, as you say, it is not an all or nothing question. You've got to have, again, we come back to humility. You've got to have intellectual humility to understand that these are very complex topics that really you're going to probably get to a better place by interacting with people who disagree with you. Like one of the central things I use large language models for is I always say, I put in something I've written about a certain belief or thesis, and I say, please generate a devil's advocate position for all of the areas where I'm wrong. And boy, I'll tell you, sometimes I've actually changed my opinions based on doing that sort of thing. And I think that, again, getting back to the Cosmos Institute, that's kind of what you're doing with the discussion groups, no?
It is, yeah. And so I agree with you about the religious character. I think it's kind of fatalistic and determined, and it surrenders human agency to this like impersonal force, which is thermodynamics. I think I'll just put a plug in for Tocqueville here. And for people that don't know, Alexis de Tocqueville was this French aristocrat, basically, who visits America in 1830. So a little bit after, the 1776 fanfare. And kerfuffle. And then writes about American democracy, the American social state, tries to understand how do we live, what are our opinions, how do the opinions influence how we live, writes the best book on democracy ever. I mean, I think I can say that. And he points out these very subtle challenges that are not about technology. It's 1830, but they merge with technology and they're very prescient. And I think there's a lot of kind of excavation that should happen. I'll just kind of give you one because you mentioned these impersonal forces. One of the things that Tocqueville says is that when you have democracy take hold, when it's thoroughly entrenched in the social state, then people stop listening to a favored class of people, right? In an aristocracy, that's what you do. You listen to the aristocrats. They instead become slavish to impersonal forces. And those could be theories. They could be majority opinion, right? Like, what does everybody else think? You can think of that as like an abstract, impersonal force. In our case, they could be algorithms, but these become the dominant things. And people kind of retreat within themselves and trust these impersonal forces. So I think the EX are doing that on the thermodynamic side. I think the effective altruists are doing that on the utilitarian side. And basically, you could have this possibility that we use AI. It appears to us to be a neutral arbiter, like it kind of has a neutral, homogeneous sort of standpoint. And we trust it to an extent that it causes enervation and weakness and kind of undermines the strength of our soul that's required to form independent judgment. So again, lots more could be said about this. But I think I worry about the kind of like intellectual conformity and the loss of the energetic use of freedom. I think Tocqueville really nails that. So just to kind of speak to Cosmos, yeah, we thought that the world basically creates these moments where philosophy matters, like the American founding or the French Revolution, right? It doesn't always work out well, but philosophy matters. This is one of those times. AI is one of those technologies. It is plausibly the end result of the modern tech project. It's a technology that can create more technology. It's a technology that can manage human life, manage the economy. And I do not take that to mean that it should. And I do not take that to mean that it should in a kind of robust way, certainly. But it can, and we must, think very carefully about that. It's also an era where we have like more possibilities opening for human agency. This like space is growing and growing and growing. What do we do with it? I think we have no idea what we do with it. And we need to, kind of give people philosophical resources to think for themselves about how to live flourishing lives. So, I can talk, just about a couple of the things that we're doing. One of the things is that we believe that, since we've been talking about the past, in the 18th century, there was a lot of like philosophy to law pipelines where you'd have philosophic ideas that get translated into law, policy, stuff like that. What we're really interested in now is philosophy to code. So we're interested in philosophical ideas around, let's say, individual human agency, free speech, ideas around the nature of reason. And rather than simply producing papers and having arguments about those, which I think is important as well, we want to translate those into math, into algorithms, and we want to translate those into open source software. This, we think, is a very important vision for the future for allowing philosophy to guide the kinds of technologies that we create, as well as for making sure that as we do this, thing we've had to do throughout history, which is restate important ideas like about freedom. I think about like Pericles giving his funeral oration to the mothers of the Athenian dead, talking about why they died for Athens. Well, it was for the freedom of Athens. We have to restate it every generation. And today, it's not just about restating it in Gen Z terms. It's about putting it into code. So that's one important project. I'm a visiting fellow at Oxford, as you mentioned. I collaborate there with a guy named Philip Corliss, who has done this in his own work. He read Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, about the nature of knowledge. It talked about what reasoning entails. He formalized that in math. He's putting it into open source Python package, which he thinks will be the best psychologically realistic model of reasoning for things like, LLMs. So he's done that, and I work closely with him. I can't talk specifically exactly about what we're doing, but it's something very big there. That's one thing. The second is we're trying to build a community of technologists who come from Anthropic, OpenAI, DeepMind, places like this, who really want to work on these questions around, classical liberal ideas, reason, philosophic questions more broadly, and who have the kind of like aptitude and attitude to ship open source software, basically. So we want to give them space to do it. So, people who want to work on technologies to counter digital authoritarianism, right? I know Zoe Weinberg and ex ante, and wonderful. Like let's create space for creating more agentic technology. People who want to make sure that individual human agency shows up in the recommender systems. Great. Let's give them space to prototype that, create an option for the world. We have a set of fellows that are Rhodes and Teal quality people who are as good as they get when it comes to AI research. We want to give them space to build those things. And then we're doing a host of other small things like reading groups. I put together something where we talk about what are the origins of the modern tech project. Like Bacon is an example. He looms largest. He in 1630 kind of wrote down some of the core ideas that led to that. But we also hit those that preceded him in the ancient world of Aristotle, and some of the critics, Tocqueville being one, Heidegger being another, C.S. Lewis being another. So we do that. I'm teaching a class at Oxford on philosophy of AI, where we're going to read things that uncover a philosophical issue, and then we're going to hear from a tech entrepreneur who's translating that into the real world. So like, for example, human creativity, we can read Nietzsche, the gay science, what do we learn from artists? What do we owe to artists? And then we can talk about how tech enhances creativity, right? It's this kind of beautiful combination of old and new. So we're doing a lot of those cool things. Last one I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is there's a thing called the Lyceum Project, where we'll go to Aristotle's school at Athens, which is kind of a plot of land now, but in the Athens Conservatory. And we'll talk about how would Aristotle's ideas influence technology ethics, because it turns out there's more to ethics than just narrow utilitarianism. And I got involved. It's an Oxford plus Stanford thing, Oxford Institute for Ethics and AI, and then Stanford High Lab. And I got involved to kind of, help practitioners go there, because I think it's not just about putting in place regulation. We actually have to, be ethical and think through these issues in complex ways as builders.
Yeah, I'm very excited about all those projects that you've got going. And what I think I'm most excited about is getting the practitioners involved. I think that, as you say, a lot of people trained in or thinking through STEM or what have you, you end up with C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures. I'm sure you've read that book, and we need to put them back together again, in my opinion. And one way to do that is all of the things that you are supporting, and so I applaud that. I also wonder sometimes about getting back to human nature. I agree that high agency is like one of the things that I admire the most, because a very highly a person with high agency, just literally, if you just I love to read biographies, and you don't find any low agency people in those biographies, right? And I wonder, as I was listening to all of the various things you've got going and the philosophers that you're citing, I recently did a salon for intellect, and it was thrown at me by my friend Anna Gatt. We're an investor in that company too, so full disclosure. And she's like, "Hey Jim, how about doing a salon on Lao Tzu and Taoism and AI?" And I'm like, "Okay, I'm game. I'll do that." And one of the things that I led with, which I thought that I literally just saw as I was getting ready to go on in about an hour and a half, was this idea of wolves that were released into Yellowstone Park. I think there were 15 of them released, and all of the completely unexpected things that happened as a result of that, right? So, because the wolves were there, the deer population went down. Because the wolves were hunting and eating them, that led to the deer choosing different locations. The locations that they vacated were allowed to thrive with the flora and fauna, which reintroduced new species of plants, new species of trees, and on and on and on. And there's a wonderful little film. I actually put it up on Twitter, and I wonder, is there room within the series for grokking that, right? Which is, boy, who would have been able to come up with all of the things that would have happened to Yellowstone, and most of them for the better, by the way, some for the worse, by just that simple sort of initial thing. And the reason I'm bringing that up is it can translate immediately to the practitioners putting it into code, right? You can have an idea of what that might achieve, but there are a lot of variables there that, like our wolves in Yellowstone, that are going to develop that you didn't anticipate. And that's why I'm so in favor of the iterate. Ooh, mistake. Let's change that. Let's pivot. Let's make sure that, fire,
Yeah.
which, go.
I know. I mean, there's so much I could say about this, but one funny one is cars helped ignite the sexual revolution. And I mentioned this because how do you predict that? I mean, maybe somebody did. I wouldn't put it past someone to predict, but like these are not just they're not just like complicated effects, but they're like orthogonal effects, And so I think this happens all the time. And then there is a lot of difficulty with imposing top-down order on complex systems. Like another one I think about is the biodome experiment, where we spent millions of dollars with the best possible science to try to create a self-contained habitat that I guess we could, take to Mars. I mean, like Elon Musk should pay a lot of attention to this because we don't know. And we did it, and we put together this amazing, experiment. And then what happens? Well, I think like insects run amok, cockroaches take over, a lot of species die out, plants do as well. And again, I can't stress enough, this is the best science possible with no real limits to funding. And so it's a great difficulty that we have. The possibilities in the future tend to outstrip the human mind's ability to predict them. I would say in AI, one thing that's encouraging is there are some people who, like Dario Amodei from OpenAI, or from was it OpenAI and then founded Anthropic, wrote a pretty incredible paper about scaling laws. And this was Andrew Ng had worked on this prior at Baidu, but he wrote it for kind of like the modern, large language model era. And what it, basically says is that if you scale a model up by, scale, I mean the amount of data, the amount of parameters, it gets better and better. And it does so with smooth curves over orders of magnitude. And, maybe we have 3-4 years left of this. Maybe we have more. But it's the reason why today it's $100 million to train, or last year it was $100 million to train. This year, $1 billion to train. 2027, $100 billion, right? It's the scaling laws that tell us this. Great. This is something I think prediction is good for, right? In other words, I'm fully supportive of saying, next year it's going to be that. And maybe we'll get surprised. Like that's not 100% confident prediction. But within this narrow self-contained technical domain, I think there can be a prediction. What happens in the economy? What are the effects when you release that bigger model, GPT-7 or whatever? No one knows. Impossible to know. And the best system is going to be the most adaptive, the one that can undertake lots of iterations, can do so with a kind of a degree of openness and preserves all the kind of adaptive feedback loop type things that the free market and the cosmos type, meaning bottom up decentralized order, sort of gives you. I think that's a key takeaway from history of philosophy and the failed experiments that ignored this sort of fallibility.
Yeah, I love the example of the attempt to create the perfect livable conditions, and I followed that very closely. And given my kind of views on it, I anticipated that a lot of things would happen that they didn't think about, and I'm always trying to be aware of like the unanticipated consequences of things. You'll often hear like, "Oh my God, I hate spiders. I wish there were no spiders in the world." And then you realize if there were no spiders in the world, we would be overrun by insects in a insignificant amount of time because they do a lot of cleansing of the insect population. But that also, again, like everywhere we look is a complex adaptive system. I think about markets that way. For example, markets are complex adaptive systems that, generally clear because you have heterogeneous beliefs within the market system, right? I could sell you NVIDIA and you could buy it from me and we could both be right? I'm 63 and have grandchildren and maybe I want to pay for a grandchild's education and you're young and have young children and maybe you want to save for a child's education. But as part of that, there are failures in complex adaptive systems. And just to use the metaphor of the market, when opinions in markets go from heterogeneity to homogeneity, oi, watch out. There you get bubbles, there you get crashes, because information cascades result. And when that information cascade gets so overwhelming to the human, like I remember the last time I saw it in real time was the .com bubble, where literally everyone was thinking exactly the same way. And everyone completely ignored all of the other permutations that could possibly happen. But yeah. I like the idea that if the more we get people understanding, you've really got to look at this at AI, at all of the permutations of what can come from AI as a complex adaptive system. And again, we get back to intellectual humility, cognitive diversity, all of the things that are going to go in to try to maximize our chances to get most of the decisions we make right. We're never going to get all decisions right, ever.
Yeah. I mean, I love that, Jim. What's interesting is both the surprise and the homogeneity happen at many levels of the system. So to give two examples, like you've made a career in quant finance, you know that cross asset correlations hold in like kind of one regime, but then when GSAM, Goldman Sachs Asset Management, liquidates its book or whatever, there's a phase locking effect where everything kind of hooks to one another and it kind of goes down, and that's when the market functions at its most terrifying. The other is that the surprises that we have are not just about, the car unlocks the sexual revolution. It's also like at very low levels, like GPUs, we all know were for graphics. They're for gaming. Now they're for AI. Stochastic gradient descent, a key technique, it was for scalability. Now it's for avoiding overfitting. Attention was for machine translation. Now it's for everything, basically. And so these are all surprises. And so the question is, like, how do you create or cultivate a system in which we can, accept that we must take some good, some bad with the good. Like there will be surprises that are negative, but basically maximally harness those surprises. And I think that relates to heterogeneity. It certainly, it certainly is very consistent with the market. What I mean by that is that the open source software model kind of beautifully allows for that, because you put something out and then millions of potential interactions, millions of experiments, millions of developers tinkering and building, and each interaction represents an opportunity to kind of use something in a delightful way or make a new insight that it's harder to do within a company, even if the company is operating very efficiently. But also, I think the sum point here is that like we would like a world that is neither fully closed nor fully open in the software sense, because that is itself a form of heterogeneity. Like it allows for you to have, incredibly planned, organizations like whatever, Amazon or something, alongside these like organismic, kind of open source movements that don't really have any shape, and that kind of operate around them. Like that's a beautiful form of heterogeneity for a resilient society.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why I am passionately in favor of open source, but not absolutely opposed to closed source being coexisting with it, is for the reason you just cited. I passionately believe that open source gets us to better outcomes. Mm-hmm. And it gets us to better outcomes because of cognitive diversity, because it's a million minds working on something that are very diverse in the way they look at things. And, there's a reason why Linux runs the web, right? It routes around problems, and a top-down system would, in my opinion, be much more brittle for a lot of the challenges and problems of the web, whereas the bottom-up, the complex adaptive system approach, which is open source, right, allows for solutions that many people, like even the top designers, would have never thought about. And exactly. So I have no problem with coexistence. I think there must be, right? Like if I come up with something super clever and I want to commercialize it and keep the magic sauce to myself, I think I should be able to do that. But I think I should also do as much as I can to contribute to the open source community, because again, to me, the very American idea of pragmatism, right? That seems to be a very pragmatic solution to dealing with these very, very complex problems. And also just study nature, study our immune system. Our immune system works, it's a complex adaptive system. And right, when the novel coronavirus comes, our immune system is like, what the fuck is going on here? And then we start going over there and the cells start like trying to figure out a way in. And what's really interesting, to me at least, is that once some of the cells of the human immune system start making progress, you know what happens? All of the other cells start going towards that point, which I find really interesting. And because it has an analog in the idea of swarms. I'm sure you've thought a lot about how swarms work. And I think in our new system, swarms are going to be a really big thing, because they are basically duplicating what's happening with the immune system and other complex adaptive systems.
I like the idea of thinking of modifications to this technology landscape as being those of a doctor, kind of thinking about a body. I like Elinor Ostrom's kind of framing on this, that it isn't about like trying to solve the top-down problem. It's about like partial solutions to like specifically defined problems that we can kind of implement and gain experience on as we go. Another really good thinker on this is James Buchanan. I had not read James Buchanan until this, Mill Fellowship. But what he kind of says is that, like, look, you gotta lay down a set of rules, let's say regarding the market, right? You have to lay down a set of rules. He's like what's called a contractarian, constitutional contractarian. So he lays down abstract rules as a form of social contract. And then what emerges from that is going to be spontaneous. It's going to have higher level system properties that aren't sort of like predictable from the individual parts in a causal sense, right? But you don't have to just let it go. You don't have to just accept wherever it goes. What you can do is you can look using reason for Pareto optimal, bargains, better bargains. Like you can find little areas where you can make tweaks. And when you do that, you can feed those back into kind of the constitutional rules. So he has this phrase in one of his texts that says that like these rules can be used in a quote, metaphorically evaluative and empirically corroborative sense. And this is a mouthful of a phrase. So I realize if you're hearing it for the first time, it might be a lot. But what he's basically saying is you lay down a set of rules, you let empirics do what empirics do, and then you loop back and you say the metaphorically evaluative piece is like, would I have chosen those rules? Knowing what I know now, would I have chosen those? And then the second is empirically corroborative, like did it kind of work or did it kind of suck? And so he's got this cool little like loop back that I think computation enables us to do in like super interesting ways. The other thing, Jim, I was going to touch on is on open source. So Vinod Khosla last week talked about how we should basically not do open source. I mean, he did Sun, and so they had a lot of formative, key open source stuff. But he's basically like open source is too risky now. I'm like paraphrasing because of China, because of U.S.-China dynamic. And then Mark Andreessen responds and says, well, if you really think that, why don't you have like actual security at OpenAI, right? Like, because, they don't. My view on this, and again, I wrote the very first DoD AI strategy, and what the debate was like in the building, in the Pentagon at that time was, we know AI is an important area for defense. We know China is making like pretty credible steps forward. What do we do? And whenever I would talk to DoD people in general, but particularly intelligence community people, they would always say a version of, we need better defenses. We need to focus on halting tech transfer. We need to get, Chinese nationals with a potential tie to the Chinese Communist Party out of higher ed. And it was all about kind of the hunkering down, right? And if I think about a football analogy, it was like, we need to boost our defense. Contrast that with a friend of mine was the COO at Google X back in the day for like a while. And they would have people come in and ransack them, like try to steal their technology. It's kind of wild, but they would do this. And rather than like making that organization a security optimized organization, they were just like, screw it. Like, we're going to go faster. That's how we're going to win, is we're basically going to go faster. Now, of course, you want to have some security. Like, I get that. You want to screen, like, I don't want a PLA, People's Liberation Army Navy person who's like, embedded at Berkeley, just shoveling, research out the door. I don't want that. But do I want Chinese nationals working on important AI projects? Hell yes. When I was doing the Google, Maven program, like everybody was Chinese on that program, and I that's totally, I mean, that's totally wonderful. So all I say here is that, I disagree with Khosla primarily because of what you said, that I think open source is critical to innovation. I think even if 99% of open source software is not strategically important, the 1% that is developed in an open way might be crucial. Banning it prevents that. We do not know what that 1% is. It's a very complex system, as you said, so you can't even really trace what that is. The other thing that I think never really gets talked about is that the spread of knowledge and technology globally, which open source helps quite a bit, even if some of it is militarily relevant, potentially does more to lift people out of poverty and thus promote peace than it does to stow conflict. It's not zero sum. You started at the beginning by saying that. It is not zero sum. So if open source can help lift more people out of poverty around the world, such that they're not kind of hell bent on extreme ideologies or taking over, resorting to military means, that is much better for humanity than the alternative.
Again, preaching to the choir here, and the idea that is difficult, it seems, for some even really, really smart people is what you just said, right? Like when you're thinking, when if you put everything into a box or a category, and you think just from that, okay, whoa, we've got to have really great security around our AI development because our adversaries are going to be able to come in, and that totally blinds you. I think it blinds you to the idea that, well, wait a minute, like if open source spreads globally and if it ameliorates poverty, what kind of new attitudes are those countries going to grow into, right? I think of South Korea as an example. As you know, South Korea for a long time was a very authoritarian country. And the influx of a middle class when they opened up the economy created the demise for the absolute totalitarian nature of the previous regime. It started happening in China too, right? We all remember Tiananmen Square in 1989. That was because Deng had opened up Chinese markets, and guess what? He hadn't thought about the fact that he was going to create a middle class that really didn't like being told that all of their thoughts were owned by the state, right? And so there's these secondary and tertiary knock-on effects that it seems to me that people just seem to not even think about. And one of the things I'm excited about AI with is, and by the way, I'm a big believer in the human in the loop type model, the Centaur model, but I'm also a big believer in, would it be great to just, for example, in scientific discovery, if you look at the loop or the hoops that scientists have to jump through to get a thesis or hypothesis funded, right, to test. Well, one of the things is they're probably not going to seek funding for a hypothesis where they suspect they're going to get a null hypothesis, right? And yet, so the entire incentive system is, oh, I'm going to discover something new and great and brilliant. And that ignores all of the information that we can learn via negativia. And like, why don't we just have an AI churn out hypothesis after hypothesis, expecting a null set, publish that to a open data set where all scientists can have access to it, and they can look. It's the Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark. That's how he knew that the intruder was known to the family, etc. And I do think that there are just so many incredible use cases for AI where we let the AI go on these speculations, right? Because guess what? In my opinion, there's probably going to be several in there where we were expecting a null hypothesis and we actually come up with something.
Yeah, I love this, Jim. I think you mentioned the human in the loop stuff. So it's often the case that people make a distinction between automation and augmentation. One of the interesting ideas that I've thought about lately is that the airplane didn't automate flying for humans. The electron microscope didn't automate the ability to see these, microscopic objects. We just couldn't do them, we just simply couldn't do them. And then to take it a step further, technologies like tumor detection, those are incredible things for AI to help us with. But as you said, AI can also help generate hypotheses and so that we grow our knowledge of cancer generally, right? Like it isn't just about kind of tasks that we've realized are important kind of components. It's this sort of like open-ended science that can happen, that can be aided by AI. So I think that's a really exciting new wave. I think one of the areas that we're kind of working on at Oxford that Philip is a real expert on, Philip Corliss, this professor there, is the nature of reason. And I do think there are enhancements to reason that would help with this scientific project. I think this is very pithy, but like the way LLMs work today is kind of like more like an artificial politician than an artificial scientist, if that makes sense. Right. And getting them to be more like the artificial scientists, I think requires a little bit of an upgrade of the reasoning capacities reasoning is everyone knows that it's important for hypothesis generation and for science generally. The way LLMs kind of work today is you have these like comprehensive generative repositories of common sense judgments, like things that, you and I would see and think, oh, that's reasonable, that's right. Like, but I don't know that that adds up yet to the reason of the kind that is needed for open-ended science. I also don't know that it's the kind that adds up to the reason that you would want for a trustworthy tutor for your 4-year-old, or for robustly respecting moral constraints. And I'll just give you one example of where like common sense versus this other thing might fall down. So if we're asking questions, if we're doing this kind of like dialectical process together, this Socratic process, at some point you're going to ask me a question where I realize that the answer that I was holding in my head can no longer be an answer. And can I grasp that by my own lights? That can happen across two people, but it actually happens, I think, internally. Like, I think we have these questioning processes in our own head when we're really thinking through something. And I don't know that LLMs can do that yet. So I think there's a little bit more work to be done at the edge of reason to be able to, move beyond just search, which will help us immensely generating this kind of, hypotheses, but also to kind of like more maybe deliberate probing of the natural world through this wonderful tool we've created.
Yeah. And as I was preparing for our chat today, I was thinking, your list again. I love your list. And you gave me a lot of great ideas. There are several books on there that I haven't read that I'm going to read now. But I also thought, probably wouldn't be bad to put some science fiction books in there as well. Have you thought about that?
Definitely, and I need to read more. I just read Consider Phlebas, the Culture series, first one, because that's one of the very rare cases where there's a positive vision for humanity, a utopian vision. And I think there's a ton to be gained from that. I've sprinkled those in my own reading, but I haven't kept it up. But I think that would be good. The other one that I would say is like kind of slept on is Russian Realism. I took a class on Chekhov this past semester for a few months. I took classes at St. John's College, which is a great books program. What I love about the Russian realists is that they're writing, by which I mean like Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Nabokov, or Turgenev rather. They're all different, and they have different degrees of like moralizing in different kind of places. But one common theme is that they're showing that humans are complex, that there's a great kind of Chekhov quote that says, I start wherever any category you could define me, you could put me in ends. They focus on the particularity of human life. They focus on the non-Newtonian characteristic of human life, how we, have our own volition, as I said earlier. And it's just this like wonderful antidote to the radical idea that you could just flatten human life with theories, that you could just kind of run a top-down state. Now, was that listened to? Was that heeded in Russia? Absolutely not. But it's for the rest of us to recover and to take heart. So yeah, I think Russian realism and the science fiction are two missing pieces that I'd love to kind of flesh out. Interintellect is like, I think they're doing incredible work, and I'm sure that these are like themes that would be right up their alley to explore. So yeah, I would love to collaborate on that.
Yeah. And if you look at our verticals at O'Shaughnessy Ventures, like that's one of the things that we think we can help add value to the discussion on, like in infinite films. We're going to make some movies that does not view all futures as dystopias. In infinite books, same idea, right? We're going to feature a lot of writers who've been largely ignored in terms of, hey, you know what? There's a lot of different scenarios where the future works pretty well. Yeah. But my challenge is I don't want them to be utopias, because as you know, utopia literally means nowhere, right?
Yeah.
And so it gets me back to the Plato, right? He's one of the first of the philosophers that your reading list covers. And, if we look at Plato the man, what we see is a guy who got really freaked out by Athens losing the war to Sparta and wrote the Republic, right? That was very reactionary. The Republic is a very reactionary text to Plato the man going, holy shit, Sparta just beat us, and I've got to write something about that, right? And the other part of Plato the man that's really interesting is that guy was one hell of a marketer, right? If you look at his various pieces, the Phaedrus and all of them, and then you kind of go back and look, interestingly enough, that they were all named after very rich Athenians and other Greeks who he would then go to and say, would you like to fund my academy?
So he wasn't as good as Karl Marx on that point, but it's funny. I'm reading the Phaedrus right now, and people ask me, like, what am I reading? I'm like, oh, I'm reading about erotic love, and it's kind of a weird answer, but it covers that and rhetoric. It's really great. But what I will say on Plato is, he gives this kind of, in laying out in the Republic, this city and speech, it's kind of utopian, but there's a subtle message there, I think, and not everyone would interpret it this way, but some would say that this city is designed to represent the demands of perfect justice, and that Socrates shows that it in fact cannot exist. That, the philosopher would have to come down and become, less than, and he makes clear in kind of the antecedent logic that this is impossible, that this doesn't fit the role of perfect justice. So it's self-contradictory. I know it's hard to kind of get up this nuanced discussion in, but essentially, when people, think that the Republic is this utopian thing, which Popper, picks up on in a big way, I think there's a subtle possibility that he's actually laying out a tension. And then the rest of history of philosophy explores this tension between, can we build the utopian future and can we not? I don't think we can, at least not in that way that we're, that's being described. There's one other point that I was going to make about, so you mentioned trying to create these films that, or not trying to, you are, that are painting a picture of a vision for humanity that is not Pollyannish, but it's not a Jeremiad, or I guess, or I don't know, whatever the opposite of that is. It's kind of like a positive vision of the world that we might create. I think this is neat. I heard it said once that, like, during the medieval period, there was a number of there was a rise of kind of these ubi sunt poems that were these like lamentations about civilizations past. It was like the medieval period was kind of like a period of stagnation, and they were looking back to the Romans and seeing the Colosseum, or seeing these like statues and columns, and saying, what race of what titans built this? What titans came before us? And it was like this kind of sad nostalgia. And so not a lot was built in the medieval period, I would say. And what are the ephemera that we are using, cultural ephemera, to kind of assemble into the next thing? Unfortunately, we're surrounded by dystopian. I was at a Santa Fe Institute thing, and I heard John Nolan. Funny story, I tweeted about him as Chris Nolan. It was my only tweet that's ever gone viral, and it was just straight up wrong. And I had talked to him at the bar that night, and he never corrected me, so I felt like an asshole. But I'll never be written into a Nolan film, I'm sure. But he said that utopias or dystopias sell twice as much as utopias. And Nolan is a very thoughtful guy. I didn't take that he was saying that he's like a slave to that reality. I did not. He's like, I was really impressed by him. He's very smart. But that is an important fact about our culture. So I think it's up to people to lead. There are films like, the people who created A Beautiful Mind. I think there's some really interesting films that I think are kind of showing what's possible. But this is a big artistic project that I think is going to go hand in hand with the philosophy development and with the tech creation to kind of lead us where we want to go.
Yeah. You bring up A Beautiful Mind. Ron Howard is a friend of mine. We had kids at the same school. And actually they were all in the chess club. And if you know anything about that, back in that day, the parents were corralled and put in a room where they couldn't interact with their children at all. And these things would go on for hours and hours and hours. So you just end up like having chats with people. And I love that you bring up A Beautiful Mind, because I thought that he did such a wonderful job with that, in terms of like just all of the things that made you think about, right? Like, objectively, John Nash's life pretty much sucked if you're John Nash, right? And yet I love the end, that where he's giving the speech after winning the Nobel. And there are the ghosts that have accompanied him the whole way along. And the other thing I loved about it, Ron does a really great job with this, in my opinion, is he gets at the incredible complexities of the story of Nash and what he achieved. But he's always really good at bringing out the humanity of the situation. And so, I mean, God, I could only dream to be able to make movies as good as Ron. But the point you bring up about the dystopias outselling utopias 2-1, well, absolutely they do. And again, I think that gets us back to human nature, and frankly, they're more exciting, right? I mean, like, who really wants to watch a 2-hour movie of everyone just like having wonderful conversations with the AI floating around and saying, Jim, did you consider this and that? Might be a little boring. Yeah. So we're trying to figure out a way to make it exciting, and yet also hopeful. You got any ideas for it?
I mean, I'd say you nailed it with The Beautiful Mind. I think it's that's why I thought to bring it up. It's, you neither want the kind of milquetoast or like weak kind of positive vision, nor do you want the kind of just fearful, like, I don't know, dog whistle stuff. It's the complexity of human life. It's the particularity. It's like this is unavoidably and essentially human. And I think the Russian realists bring it out. Like, Ron Howard does a great job. I think, those Russian authors, like, no one would accuse them of painting a overly rosy picture in Anna Karenina, but it's human, and it points the way past ourselves. So I wish you luck. It's a very difficult project, but then again, so is Cosmos Institute. So maybe that's what we're both drawn to.
Yeah. Well, this has been amazingly fun for me. I want to get one question in, because you're also an expert in defense tech, and you did the Project Maven and or contributed to, and you also mentioned Mark Andreessen's tweet, where he talks about, if AI in 2024 is approximately equal to atomic tech in 1943, then, right? Obviously, he's setting us up here with this tweet. But what are your, and you've touched on them already, but like one of the things that I worry about was outlined in the book AI 2041, 10 scenarios for the AI future. And the one that really got me kind of like scratching my head and saying, damn, was they had a scenario in which autonomous drones with a drop of your DNA or my DNA basically are hunter-killers, and they only kill one person. The person whose DNA is in that hunter drone. Like, I don't want to end on a really bad note, but like, what do you think about those kind of scenarios, and how can we address them? Not try to hide them away and say, "Oh, don't worry, we're working on that. We're going to have countermeasures." I fully believe we will have countermeasures, but how do you look at, and maybe we don't have to address that exact scenario, but how do you look at our to be open enough to address a lot of these terrifying, like, I mean, we're talking about movies, right? That'd be a great movie because it's so scary. What do you think about that?
Well, so one thing that came to mind when you brought up Andreessen's tweet that if AI was like nuclear weapons in the 40s or 50s or whatever, what would we think then? And I think about this phrase, which like sounds like it's very offensive, but I don't mean it that way, which is that our Germans need to be better than their Germans. And this is obviously from an old movie, Dr. Strangelove. And
I love that movie.
yeah, and what I mean by that is that I think we need wonderful talent from all over the world, and brilliant people who are in Silicon Valley and other places thinking about this problem set, and helping modernize the military, which is in desperate need of it. I spent a lot of time, advising, special operations command and other areas. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs I did a project with on North Korea and a variety of things, and we're in desperate need of more progress. And but I think what's tricky about this one is one of the threads you see in political philosophy and history is that there are a lot of really difficult debates about, what is justice, what is, the role of reason in politics or whatever. And then there's this Tasmanian devil that comes through, which is national security, and it ruins everything. It's like it's the deepest challenge to the coherence of any political philosophy is the fact that, hey, if you're getting destroyed, like if you're actually going to be, extinguished in war, then you end up doing almost anything to survive. And that topples kind of the plans of the political theorists. I'm being a little bit extreme about it, but I think that's a real challenge. So then where I go to is if I know that possibility exists, well, one, maybe as an aside, I reject a number of the common solutions to these challenges, which are things like treaties. I think we should have treaties. I think every war is precipitated by a broken treaty. And I can give you like a graveyard of treaties that, there was a pretty good treaty that Putin ignored when he attacked Ukraine, for example. And so I think treaties alone do not solve it. I think where I finally get back to in like a first principle sort of way is like, if you have a democratically controlled, lawful military whose job is primarily defensive and who actually operates in that way, that military needs modern technology to be able to function, to do its job. It needs checks in the court system and so forth. But if you have that kind of a military, and if there are other militaries that are authoritarian in nature, that don't respect human rights, then we need to be better than those militaries in wielding military force. And at the end of the day, like it's sort of like there's a potential clash of military systems. But as I said, like I don't view it as in the kind of like fatalistic, determined way. I don't think it's the case that we will go to war with China. But I think we will. The next few years in the Department of Defense are going to be enormously important to say whether we can like credibly deter it. Because right now we're not doing a very good job at fielding AI solutions in operational capacities in the military.
Yeah, and I think that's the right tenor to take in terms of looking at these problems. And I love the metaphor of the Tasmanian devil because it's part of the. We've been talking for our entire conversation about the sort of dogmatic people who just want to like throw everything they can to destabilize a coherent and hopefully creative conversation about all of these things. And at the end of the day, I think that's also a very, very important aspect of moving forward, right? If we make things off limits, it's like kids, right? If you say you cannot do this, guess what the kids want to do, right? It's like Christopher Bugley in his "Thank You for Smoking" satire book. In it, there's a protagonist who is a lobbyist for the tobacco industry, and who secretly tries to get Congress to make them put a skull and crossbones on packs of cigarettes, because he goes, do you know how much that'll increase our sales? So trying to make things by and large taboo, and no, we cannot discuss that, I think really retards movement forward. And therefore, like, I will bring up ideas that, like, I don't personally subscribe to, but I think, look, they're out there and people are going to talk about them and use them. And, who knows, maybe it'll be incorporated into the Cosmos Institute.
Yeah. Here's to bring up ideas, even if they're not right. I love chapter 2 of On Liberty, where he says that the idea is either true, in which case it's good to bring up, it's partially true, in which case it can combine with something else, or it's false, in which case it can give a clearer sense and a livelier impression to the truth. And so it's sort of like this ultimate argument for bringing forth ideas. And in fact, he says that as fallible beings, the greatest, confidence we can have, the greatest conviction we can ever attain is through inviting everyone everywhere to challenge our ideas, all comers.
Amen. I think that is a wonderful summation of the way I look at the world, and I think you look at the world as well. Well, if you're familiar with the podcast, you know that our final question makes you the emperor of the world. We do have a few ground rules. You can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do is, speaking of Nolan, you can incept people. We're going to hand you a magical microphone, and you get to speak two things into it. And the two things that you speak into it, the entire population of the world is going to wake up whenever their next morning is. And they're going to say, gosh, I've just had two of the best ideas ever. And unlike all the other times, I'm actually going to act on these ideas. What two things are you going to accept?
Yeah, so I think one is a love of liberal education, by which I mean the inquiry into the ends of what is the good life, which will surely not arrive at the answer to that question. And we definitely won't arrive at it from the emperor. In other words, there won't be a sort of unitary answer to this question. But for individuals, a love of that kind of like open-ended inquiry that takes a life and is never solved and enhances reason all the while. And then the second is this sense of epistemic humility, this sense of reason as a superpower, as something that, sets us apart from the animals, but that can only take us so far. If we can activate our reason in thinking through how do we live in a world like that, where we acknowledge this limitation and say, all of the reformer instincts, all of the best plans that we have, the greatest intentions must be put through this acid wash of epistemic humility. We emerge with systems like the kind that, Jim, you're advocating for in the world and that we've discussed today.
Love both of those, Brendan. And this has been so much fun for me. We'll have to do a round two because we didn't get to half the things I wanted to get to. But before we go, tell our listeners and viewers where they can find you.
Yeah, so we've got a Substack on Cosmos Institute that we're going to start putting out, not just interesting intellectual pieces, but also we're gonna do a formal kind of launch post here soon where I can talk, and we'll go back and you can hear we previewed it here, but we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of exciting things we're launching. So check that out. And then the reading list is on brendanmccord.com. So please check that out and send me inputs. I can, update that as I get additional wisdom from listeners.
Absolutely great. Thank you so much for your time. I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic and hope to be a collaborator with you on it.
Looking forward to it. All right. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.